Welcome to Tough Talk. I'm your host, Paul Taros, and today my guests are Lija Hogan, who is a board member of Voters Not Politicians, and Tony Daunt, who is the executive director of the Michigan Freedom Fund and who is against Proposal 2. Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you.
So, Lija, what would Proposal 2 do?
So in brief, Proposal 2 is all about establishing an independent citizens redistricting commission here in Michigan. So as you know, every 10 years we have a census across the United States, and as a result of that, we use that information to draw new district lines. And right now, politicians essentially drive that process. And what an independent citizens redistricting commission would do is bring fairness, impartiality, and transparency to that process.
Okay, Tony, what's your view of Proposal 2?
Well, as you mentioned, I am opposed. The Michigan Freedom Fund is opposed, and as are numerous, countless other groups and members of the grassroots that we work with. And the reasons for that are, they're numerous, but four that I've focused on are that it is costly. It's for all intents and purposes, it is a blank check for this commission. It is unaccountable, it is complex, and it is unfair. And I'd be happy to discuss each of those more in depth, but I certainly don't want to take all the time here right at the outset. But essentially, when you take those four items and you look at the details involved with each of those concerns, and it's bad policy to begin with, but then if we look at the idea of putting it in our Constitution, I think that it's an experiment that Michigan voters have traditionally been skeptical of, putting large, complex things in our Constitution over the last several decades, and I think they'd be wise to vote no on this one. Okay.
Well, why don't we start with one of those topics that Tony mentioned, the cost.
Yeah.
How would you respond to Tony on that?
I think, the history of this has been, we haven't had any transparency into how much this process has really cost until recently with some documents that have been released as part of the League of Women Voters suit challenging the 2010 district lines. And one of the things that is, very important to ensure is that we have just enough funds to ensure that the process that would be undertaken by the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission would be well supported, and that that money would not be able to be impacted in any way by the legislature. So that is a part of the proposal, and it's a relatively minimal amount of money just to make sure that we have, fairness, impartiality, and transparency into the system.
Okay, Tony?
And I think that what this group is seeking to do in terms of minimizing some of the gamesmanship that political parties and politicians engage in certainly makes sense. And I think in a broad stroke, it makes sense to protect voters and to protect citizens from politicians and some of their more selfish instincts. But we also need to make sure that we're protecting taxpayers from this commission. And if you look at the language of this proposal, which I have done more times than I ever thought I would, it becomes apparent that there is a minimum established in there for what should be spent. A minimum of 25% of the Secretary of State's general fund budget, a minimum salary. But there is nothing in there that establishes a maximum, a ceiling. And I think that is, it's unfortunately either a mistake that was missed or it was designed intentionally that way. But I think either one of those is disqualifying in terms of its ability to be in our Constitution, and that alone is enough. The fact that we have established a minimum but no maximum for the taxpayers of what they may end up spending on this.
Okay, I want to stay on that for a second. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I think the major piece of it that I would really respond to is, essentially we have no transparency. We have no idea how much money is being spent by lobbyists or special interests right now. And we're only, I think, really understanding the tip of the iceberg coming out of the last round. And since we don't have transparency into all of the money that was spent, we don't know how much was spent. And it could well have been far in excess of any amount that we would be spending as part of creating this, and doing the work of this commission.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt you, but I have to ask her a follow-up question.
Sure, absolutely.
You said we have no idea what the lobbyists spend. Well, that's not taxpayer money, so why should we?
Yeah, we should be concerned because, essentially when people spend money to affect policy, they're affecting policy. And so they're making choices that are in lobbyists or special interests' best interest and not in the best interest of the citizens of Michigan. And so by having transparency and having, essentially a careful and I think reasonable amount of money apportioned, to be spent on this transparent and independent commission, we will have an understanding of the motivations, how much, why, all the decision making that goes into the process of drawing those lines the next time around.
Okay, Tony, would you like to?
You made a valuable point in terms of where that money is being spent from, and it is an important difference of what private sources are spending versus what taxpayers are spending, and this issue of transparency. I am fully on board with additional transparency with our government at all levels. I think it's foolish that FOIA applies to local, city hall meetings and township board meetings and things like that, but not the legislature, not the executive office of the governor. So transparency is important, but so is protecting the wallets of our taxpayers. And just because there's a minimum established does not mean that that's what the spending is going to be. I can't think of a program that's come in at the minimum or come in under budget in terms of government funding. And with something like this that's going in our Constitution, I believe a maximum, at a minimum, a maximum should be established. And that gets to the next point I had made of unaccountability. And when the legislature spends too much or when the legislature does something that we don't like, we do have the ability to vote for them or vote against them, to hold them accountable. The folks on this commission, once selected, they would be accountable to no one but themselves. The only way of removing somebody from this would be kind of like Survivor, voting them off the island. It's, the people on the committee would be in charge of holding their own accountable. And if there's a critical mass of those who aren't in it for the right reasons, well, then that accountability means nothing.
Did I read that you would need 10 of the 13 to vote somebody off?
I believe that is correct. That's how I read it.
Yeah, I think I think definitely we kind of disagree on this point, but I think one of the things to think about is it's actually, due to gerrymandering, very difficult to hold politicians accountable because they draw lines that protect essentially incumbent parties. And so I think that the ability of voters to hold politicians accountable is undermined by our current system, and a lot of people are very frustrated by that right now. And that is something that essentially, if we have a commission that's drawing fair lines, would be more natural and something that voters would be able to do more effectively in that new system.
Okay, Tony, what do you?
I can understand some of the frustration. Again, I'm as a conservative. I'm conservative because I am skeptical of government. I'm skeptical of politicians, and I understand some of that cynicism with them not listening on both sides of the aisle, not listening to the people that they represent. But this idea that this 13-member commission, randomly selected individuals, is going to be a panacea for this, and it's based on this theory that, they will draw more fair lines. Well, there's nothing that is a guarantee in that, and we're seeking to take politics take the political out of politics, and I don't think you can do that. And this will be just another set of issues, replacing one set of issues with another. And again, they may not listen all the time, but at a minimum, they do have to stand for election at a primary election, at a general election, and then face town halls or interaction with the voters. The people on this committee, again, they are once on that commission. The only way they can be removed for really any reason is if enough of their members vote them off. And I think that takes the power out of our hands and puts it into a very even smaller set of people than the legislature.
Okay. I want to move on to this idea that this proposal is nonpartisan. Is it really nonpartisan?
Really is. That's part of the reason why I got involved myself, actually, because I really wanted a way to essentially make democracy function better in Michigan, make our representation really accountable and responsive to the needs of Michiganders, regardless of their political party affiliation or alignment. I do think that one of the reasons why I am so in favor of this particular process and structure is that it really enables everyone in Michigan to have a say in the drawing of lines. So ahead of any lines being drawn, there have to be 10 public hearings, and that means that any citizen in Michigan can come and represent their business community, their school community, their religious community, and say, we have this feedback for you as you consider drawing the lines. And, that is a level of accountability because essentially, enabling people to come and have a say in that public hearing, and the minutes of that would be also public, is a really important way of ensuring that Michiganders have a say in their representative government. And then also, after those lines are drawn, the commission also has to hold an additional 5 hearings to get feedback on those lines. And so that means that if there's any feedback about, whether or not the lines are make sense or represent the values of the people who are in those communities, there is an opportunity to provide that feedback. And right now that just doesn't happen because this process is completely held behind closed doors, and citizens don't know often the impact of what those lines are going to be until it's already been voted on by the legislature.
Okay. Tony, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I certainly, I've been doing these things for a number of weeks now. I've been involved with this. And certainly, the work that Lija has done, the work that the folks on, the volunteers on this, they should be commended for the work that they've done. And I'm sure that the vast majority of them are doing this because they truly believe in it, and I wouldn't question that. But, looking at it from the perspective of somebody on the right, if you look at the executive committee or the leadership board of this, when it was at a minimum when it was first established back in 2017, we did some digging into their campaign finance records and who they had given money to, and of the individuals on that committee, they had given exclusively to either Democratic politicians or left-leaning causes, nothing to Republican candidates or right-leaning causes. And that was kind of a red flag. To say it was nonpartisan or independent just didn't jive with us. Was kind of misleading maybe in some fashion. We focused on that. And then it was basically proven when, in the last couple of weeks here, Eric Holder's group, the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, I think it's called, donated $250,000 to this campaign. And I look at it, if people from the right had started this, and there was no activity of anybody on that leadership committee from active on the left, and then a large Republican activist group gave a $250,000 contribution, I think people on the left would be rightfully suspect of its motives. And I think that right there is a red flag to the purported claims of seeking a nonpartisan independent commission. I think we should really take that into account when we're thinking about this.
Okay. Following up on donations, I did some research also. I saw that the Michigan UAW donated $100,000. And an organization from Texas called Action Now Initiative donated $250,000. Could you tell me who Action Now Initiative is and why is an organization from Texas donating to a proposal in Michigan?
So I think the bigger part of the story is that, we've had over 10,000 donations from individuals in Michigan. And on average, those donations have been $60 or less. And those donations from across the ideological spectrum actually represent a much larger proportion of the total dollars that have been donated to Voters Not Politicians. And I think, the other piece to think about there is that, we really enjoyed really strong support from across the ideological spectrum, as we were going through the signature gathering process. So we gathered, over 425,000 signatures in a very short period of time. We basically took, about maybe 2/3 of the time that it would normally take, and we used only volunteers. So we had no paid signature gatherers, and that really speaks to the strong grassroots support that we have enjoyed. And I just have to say, yesterday I was actually out canvassing in Milan Township, and people there were very supportive, and I was actually canvassing along with somebody who has been aligned with the Republican Party. And so we have a number of volunteers who have been, independent, who have been aligned with the Republican Party, who have been aligned with the Democratic Party. And then when they become volunteers, we ask them to check that partisan stance and affiliation at the door, because we really do want them to be representing our nonpartisan efforts.
Okay. But my question was, who is this group Action Now Initiative from Texas that donated $250,000?
Yeah, they are, really interested in ensuring that we have, strong representative democracy, and they look across the country for, causes that are, aligned with those interests. And, here, as in Missouri, as in Utah, we have a ballot initiative where the people of Michigan have decided that, they really want to change how it is that we draw the lines. And so, we're not alone in this. This is something that, people across the country are looking at doing more seriously. And in Michigan, we're lucky enough to, have as part of our political process the ability to essentially have a ballot initiative. So we're lucky enough to do that.
Okay, Tony, you.
Related to the partisan nature of things, and I don't think that people can, especially in such a political process as this, that you can realistically check your partisan leanings at the door when you sign on to this, and regardless of if this was entirely Republican driven or Democratic driven, this sounds good on the surface, and numerous people that I have spoken to who this is they see me on TV or they see something we put out through our group on this, they say, well, I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know about the cost and the fact that there is no maximum established. I didn't know that there was really no way to remove these people. I didn't know that this thing is so complex in so many words. And so when you dig into it, it becomes a little more suspect. And I think that as people learn more about this and learn some of the finer details that you don't hear in a catchy slogan like "Voters Not Politicians," I think it becomes a little more tough for them to swallow.
Okay. I was, a number of months ago, I was first asked to sign the petition from a friend of mine who's a staunch Democrat. And I held off. I didn't sign it. I did some research and then realized it didn't seem like this was really nonpartisan. And in fact, the driving force, Katie Fahey, wasn't she at Hillary's anticipated victory party? And then right after that Donald Trump won, didn't she start this proposal?
So, this actually is something that is not new in Michigan politics. So, there's been, a fair number of efforts over the years to essentially establish an independent citizens redistricting commission. One of them actually dates back to the Constitutional Convention back in 1963, I believe that was. But, over the years, we've had efforts from both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats in our legislature to write legislation that would do pretty much just what it is that we're doing right now. The problem is that, politicians have a very tough time essentially saying, we're not going to protect our own interests. And so this has had to be an effort that has had to come from, a grassroots community, group of Michiganders. And, I think that's really important to keep in mind because, this is a way of ensuring that Michiganders do have a voice in what it is that, the process is around drawing the lines that help us to select our politicians who represent us.
Okay, Tony?
And, I think as I mentioned earlier, especially having gotten to know Katie through doing these and sitting in green rooms and things like that with her, I certainly don't question her motives in terms of, why she's doing this. But again, you have to look at the facts as they are. And what you had stated is in fact the case. There was a news story about it following election night. And so I look at that more as not questioning the motives or what somebody's underlying beliefs are related to this, but I think it's another piece of the puzzle to consider when looking at this. I think the left, people on the left, Democrats, would be rightly suspect of something like this if it was started by somebody who was at Donald Trump's inauguration or who had been at George W. Bush's inauguration in 2004. Those are things that we can't just set aside because the claim is that it's independent or nonpartisan. But what Leah is mentioning in terms of a better way, a valuable conversation to have, but the bottom line is that we've got a binary choice in front of us, and it is Proposal 2 the solution for this problem? And I think when you look at those items that I've laid out and that have been laid out by others of the cost, the unaccountability, the complexity, the unfairness, take all of those, bad policy to begin with, to put it in the Constitution is just dangerous.
Okay. I want to follow up with your question, and I'll ask you, Leah. Mm-hmm. Tony made a very valid point. I don't think anybody's disagreeing that maybe the current system needs to be, reformed. There's some crazy districts. I mean, no one's going to say these districts make sense. Mm-hmm. But is Proposal 2 the best way, especially, as Tony said, putting this in the Constitution to fix these problems?
Well, I wouldn't be spending all of my volunteer time doing it if I didn't think so.
Oh, come on, change your mind.
No, but I think that one of the things that we've seen across the country as more states have moved in the direction of, have establishing for themselves independent citizens redistricting commissions, is that depending on where they are, it's the side that is, currently in power typically is the one that feels the most concerned about what's going on. And in other states, that's been the Democrats. In some other states, it's been Republicans. I do think that, it just right now, because of where we are in Michigan, it just happens to be the Republicans, but it could very well be Democrats because, over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the control of the redistricting process has actually changed hands a number of times. And so it just is a matter of timing that this is happening the way that it is now. And I do think that, you know, it's a durable solution because it's something that is not really aimed at just addressing what it is that's going to happen after the 2020 census, but further along the line too. And so, you know, I think that the answer is definitely, in my mind, yes. And I think that it's a good, durable solution for all the citizens of Michigan because it enables them to be a part of that process where they can't do that right now. And I would say one other piece, you know, I'm not a lawyer. Not a lawyer by training, not a lawyer by like any stretch of the imagination. And yet, you know, I have read plenty of documents that are in legalese. And one of the wonderful and refreshing things that I find is that you can actually read the language that we have and it's in plain English. And so pretty much anybody can go to our website and read the language themselves and be able to understand what it does and what it means for themselves.
Okay, Tony?
I'm also not a lawyer, and I would push back that you know it's not nearly the plain language that Leah would have you believe. I think it is because of its complexity. It is, you know, pretty legalese and legalistic in many ways, and that's what happens when you write something that's 3,200 words long. And you know, I've been pointing out that 3,200 words, for some context, is, you know, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. When you put those together, those are about 6,300 words. And so the three main documents for our system in the United States of America, this is fully one half, and we're adding that to the Michigan Constitution. There will be unintended consequences. There will be mistakes. There will be a lack of a maximum spending authority. There will be instances that will need fixing when this is implemented. And because it's a constitutional amendment, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to make those changes. And that's yet another strike against this, and why people should vote no on November 6th or earlier if you are voting absentee.
Okay. Speaking of the wording, I've read that there's quite a bit of ambiguity with the words community of interest. That, you know, community of interest is to be taken into account when drawing these district lines. Isn't this giving kind of a loophole to let people draw lines that maybe will resemble what we have today?
So I think there are a lot of things that would essentially prevent that from happening, drawing the lines as we do today. And part of that really is the process itself makes it very difficult to draw the lines the way that they are drawn today. What we have, you know, essentially is a process that happens behind closed doors, and we don't have any visibility into, you know, why it is the lines were drawn the way they were. And, you know, I can't right now go to someone and say, well, why is, you know, Bloomfield here and why is Monroe there? And
okay, I got to interrupt you.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time.
Okay.
We have about 30 seconds left. Tony, I just want to give you brief time to respond to that.
I would just, you know, there are standards in place for how the lines are drawn. Communities of interest is a very nebulous term. You know, it's not definable in the way that APOL standards or the Voting Rights Act are. And just another check mark in the need to vote no on this.
Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank both of you for taking time to appear on the show. And to our viewers, please do your research and vote either early or on November 6th. So, thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.